Welcome to all. So this is our Latin America session, and we have 3 speakers for this evening, which is very exciting. So we'll get to really hear the presentations. We'll have a little time to discuss. Our first speakers are Eduardo Portillo and Maria Eugenia Davila. They are the creators of Venezuela, and they have brought silkworm cultivation, indigo dyeing, and integrated these with metallurgy in Venezuela. Their love of the Andean landscape and people has inspired their work. Maria.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. We are very grateful to the Textile Society of America for giving us the opportunity to share our experience in the mountain range of Cordillera de Mérida, Venezuela, a place where we used to go to enrich our gaze, to obtain the wool that we use in our studio, to share moments of amazement with the weavers of the Paramo and participate in their traditional festivals. As artists, we are interested in the relationship of people, landscape, and culture, as well as process and materials. And in this presentation, we will try to illustrate the encounter we find between the Paramo and its inhabitants. The Paramo is an ecosystem of the highest Andes between 3,000 and 4,300 meters above sea level. It's considered to be found in the Andes of Venezuela. Land is the word that translates into English the word páramo. In this presentation, we'll use the Spanish word páramo, and we'll refer to the páramos of the Venezuelan tropical Andes, specifically Mucuchíes town, area, and its surroundings. There are several definitions of páramo, and one of them, which is very close to our experience, is that the páramos resemble a continental archipelago surrounded by a sea of jungle. The environmental extremes due to the strong variation in the climate and the high solar radiation allow the development of different endemic species in the area. The most relevant and emblematic are the frailejón plant, Spelitia species, and the condor, Vultugriffus. The páramo are the result of the multiple environmental and anthropogenic factors. The páramos, and in particular their lagoons, had always been considered sacred and mysterious spaces, a perception that has been inherited up to the present by peasant society. This region was difficult to access well into the 20th century. A unique culture around the potatoes and wheat cultivation was formed there. In 1926, the Transandean Road was opened and connected the Venezuelan and with the rest of the country and brought great changes in the population living conditions. There are several popular festivities related to the Catholic religious calendar. On this occasion, the people from the Páramos come down from the most remote village to celebrate and share in community. The Fiesta San Isidro Labrador takes place during May to celebrate the cultivation of land and is attended by the farmers and their oxen that parade decorated with fruits, vegetables, and work tools. It is a great opportunity to enjoy the simple pleasures of life. The celebration of San Benito has a special relevance too. San Benito is a particularly venerated saint throughout the Andean region, and his festival is a blend of color, history, religion, organization, and encounter. The devotees try to emulate their saint by painting their faces with black ink, the dress with different attires, and dance accordingly to the group to which they belong, and in some cases, their organization is very rigid. In the case of the most extreme contrast, coldness, long and encounters, long distance, and the muscle of people in the village, the wool weaving still survives in the Páramos. The material culture in some areas is related even today to what is necessary to live due to the precarious condition and scarcity that the Andean Paramo had has for centuries. House heating revolves around the wood stove, so most of the activities are carried out in the kitchen to a low proximity to the heat source. The knowledge has been transferred from one generation to another, especially those on dyeing with natural plants that requires awareness of the place to identify and collect the stuff and the process of dyeing wool. The woven pieces are based, on open warp. Generally, raw cotton is used for the warp and single-stranded hand-spun wool for the weft that covers and give the website appearance to the fabric. In some cases, wool is also used as a warp. Infinite variations are obtained with the use of colored stripe. Small checkboards, drawings, and columns are built by alternating contrasting colors. Tapestry technique is another resource used to create geometric figures. The intrinsic textile geometry is enhanced by the wool thickness, creating weaves with a graphic imprint. Great contrasts are observed using natural white and dark wool without dyeing, as well as subtleties in the use of natural grays and brown. Sometimes different natural shades are used along with dye wool. Natural dyes are used for the reds, the raicita or little root. For the yellows, the ojito or little eyes. For the blues, the añil, Indigo Victoria, orange and brown of the barba de piedra or stone bird. Expressive pieces of a single color were also woven with an infinite number of shades that come from the wool variation. Some commissioned pieces are customized by the weavers themselves with embroidered initials of the future owners. There are several finishing techniques using braiding that surrounds the edge and ensure the stability of the weave. Also, it can be done collecting the warp threads and inserting them into the weave border, sometimes by knotting the warp threads and leaving them as decoration. Great weavers left their mark, especially mention to Margarita Mora, Maria Águeda Dávila, Dora Sánchez, Guillermo Sánchez, Estefanía Rivas, Enedina Sánchez, Cecilio Santiago in Este Choc, Trujillo State, and among them, Juan Félix Sánchez stand out in a special way. In 1943, Juan Félix Sánchez and Epifania Gil moved to the Páramo El Tisore, one of the most remote places in the Cordillera of Mérida. In this isolated valley, Juan Félix Sánchez develops an intensive work that ranges from architecture, wood carving, narrative, and weaving. He makes one of his most important contributions. After observing a four-shaft loom and understanding the possibilities that are opened up by adding one more frame, he introduced a third shaft to this two-shaft traditional loom. He begins to weave diamonds and zigzags, alternating two colored yarns, which became an aesthetic and technical innovation. In Juan Félix Sánchez's work, we can observe the purpose of what is necessary, what is indispensable for life, and according to his work, with the aesthetics of the ugly that becomes beautiful in the hands of the artist. Despite the introduction of modern and industrial clothes and blankets, wool weaves have another destination. They obtain a high appreciation and have been recognized and collected. There are some private collections in the country that treasure them. There are many open questions and a lot of room for research on wool weaving at the Venezuelan Andes. The purity of the materials and the honesty using them, the simplicity of the drawings and the silent beauty of blankets and ruanas of the Param make the physical expression Venezuelan and the weavers and the blankets made under the Maramo people, their searches and needs, their its existence comfort us and evidence there are many ways of living and also many ways to weave. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Maria Davila. And they will be back for questions. I think both Eduardo and Maria will be with us. And so now I would like to introduce the real Maria Smith. Maria Smith is a doctoral candidate in the anthropology department at Syracuse University. Her presentation, titled Creating the Sensible, Weaving the Colonial Aesthetic at a Colonial Obraje, has been nominated for the Founding President's Award. Maria, take it away.
Alrighty. Thank you, everyone. It's very exciting to be part of such a great and very interesting panel, or session, I should say. Let's see, this will go, okay. When I was 8, my grandma tried to teach me to cross stitch, but she gave up because every time I picked up the needle, I would be stressed to literal tears. 6 years later, I almost failed the sewing portion of my home economics class because my stress level rose to the point that I hyperventilated each class. So, no one was more surprised than me when I announced that I was going to learn to weave. It's for science, I told myself. After all, how could I research colonial Andean textiles if I did not know about the weaving process firsthand? In June 2018, I visited Chincheros in Ayacucho, Peru for a preliminary research trip to the former Obraje, or textile mill, de San Marcos de Chincheros, or further known as the ODC. The colonial textile mill produced hundreds of thousands of yards of woolen cloth during its operation from the 1570s through the 1820s. During this preliminary research trip, several community members mentioned that they had textiles produced at the ODC by their ancestors. Therefore, in preparation for my 2019 research trip, I enrolled in a weaving course offered at Syracuse University. When I arrived in Chincheros in 2018, I felt prepared to analyze the colonial textiles that the community told me about the previous year. To my surprise, these textiles neither resembled the late intermediate period LIP textiles that I saw in museums, nor did they resemble the textiles depicted in early Spanish Golden Age paintings. Rather, the ODC textiles had characteristics that separated them from their ancestors, while maintaining certain similarities to ancestral textiles. And right here, I'm going to stop and note that I apologize. I'm not going to be showing any photos from the ODC textiles. While community members were really excited to have me look at them and to analyze them, they were not yet sure about me sharing photos with the public. I was hoping to gain their trust while I was down there this summer to re-explain what I wanted to do by showing the photos. But obviously because of COVID, I wasn't able to go down. So unfortunately, I still do not have permission to publicly share the photos. So I'm sorry for those of you who are wanting to see those. Hopefully soon I'll be able to share that. Archival documents related to the ODC demonstrate the diverse assortment of tools, materials, peoples, and knowledge that converged at the ODC and produced the textiles preserved by the Chincheros community. I draw upon color, wool, and weave of these textiles to demonstrate how Andean weaving techniques interwove with Spanish weaving techniques and colonial innovations to create Chincheros colonial Andean textiles. Before delving into the colonial textiles, I will briefly describe the ODC and contextualize the weaving techniques and traditions that were woven together during the colonial era. When the Spanish arrived in the Andes, they encountered an exceptionally developed textile industry. Andean weavers produced textiles of arguably superior quality to that of their European counterparts. Andean textiles sent back to Spain, quote, excited the admiration and the envy of the European artisan, end quote. Spain's textile industry had unraveled during the Reconquista, and the Spanish textile makers were rebuilding the industry when the Spanish arrived into the Americas. Unlike in Spain, Andean textile production was well established throughout local communities, so it was not unwound by the Inca Civil War. In the LIP Andes, weaving cloth was a domestic industry that predated the expansion of the Inca Empire. Everyone was acquainted with the weaving process as textile production was communal. Camelid wool was spun with drop spindles called puskas. I'm sorry, my Quechua pronunciation is terrible. The wool was then woven on backstrap looms, which rely upon the weaver's body weight to maintain proper tension. Most impressive to the Spanish was the Andean weaver's ability to create flawless double-sided brocade in vibrant colors. The diverse ecosystems located within the Andes afforded weavers a diverse array of dye agents that created vivid colors, many of which we've just seen. Spanish weaving was done by women at home or by male artisans who underwent long apprenticeships to hone their craft. Ovine, or sheep's wool, was spun with spindle wheels, the predecessor to the spinning wheel. Once spun, the wool was woven on treadle looms, a technology that had been brought to Spain through Asian trade routes. The large wooden loom relies upon various mechanisms to maintain tension whilst weaving. Vibrant dye agents were rare in Renaissance Europe. Most vibrant dyes were imported from Asia. Therefore, utilitarian cloth lacked the vibrant coloring of Andean textiles. Before the Reconquista, many Iberian textile producers were Muslims, whose ancestors brought Asian weaving techniques and technologies to Spain. When the Reconquista ended and non-Catholics were largely expelled from the peninsula, the Iberian textile market collapsed. The weakened and mediocre Iberian textile industry could neither meet the demand nor the superior quality expected by Andean markets. Therefore, in 1545, the first Andean obraje was established in the Wawa Valley. In theory, obrajes were meant to import Spanish weaving implements to be utilized by indigenous weavers. However, in reality, obrajes challenged colonial requirements. Royal requirements, laborer demands, resource availability, and economic profitability all converged at the obrajes and shaped the technologies and techniques utilized at specific obrajes. As the following illustrations exemplify, there, the indigenous and Spanish technologies and techniques were interlaced to create the colonial aesthetic. Located 148 kilometers outside of Ayacucho lies the former ODC, royally licensed in the 1570s as a textile mill. The ODC was composed of a church, administrator housing, a corral, and several workspaces where textiles were in Cusco and Lima. Indigenous and mestizo laborers from across the region staffed the ODC. Individuals worked on one specific part of the textile production process based upon their age, gender, and race. While women stayed continuously at the Obraje for years at a time, men had to shuttle back and forth from the ODC to the mines in Huancavelica to serve their mita. The peripatetic nature of men's labor meant there was greater inconsistency in the fulling, dyeing, and napping of cloth, all of which were men's jobs. The spinning, cleaning, and weaving jobs, which were assigned to women and children, were more consistent due to the settled nature of women's and children's lives. Women and children were often trapped at the ODC under an illegal system of debt peonage that only allowed men to leave to serve their mita. Despite the harsh and inhumane treatment of textile producers at the remote ODC, they maintained a great deal of power over colonial society. Textile producers in the Viceroyalty of Peru determined the physical characteristics of the textiles they produced. Their labor afforded them a position of power as they exuded influence over the sensible characteristics of the textiles used in daily life. Through their labor, ODC textile produced the creation of the colonial aesthetic. I understand aesthetic as the embodied knowledge that shapes sensorial perceptions which open themselves up to metaphoric meaning. The sensorial characteristics and metaphoric meanings of ODC textiles distinguished casta, or a caste-based system. Due to the mutable nature of the casta system, quote, colonial actors relied on individuals' clothing, overall lifestyle, and social networks to perform the difficult work of translating their existence into the language of caste, end quote. Clothing was a signifier of social status in the Inca Empire, so the continuation of clothing as an identity marker was not an altogether foreign concept for many indigenous communities. The continued reliance upon aesthetics to convey social hierarchy placed textile producers in positions central to the effective enactment of colonial social mores, despite their low cost of status. Various dye agents are noted within the ODC inventories, and the corresponding colors are depicted in Costa paintings. The most frequently noted dye agent in the ODC inventory is anil. Anil is a form of indigo dye native to South and Central America. Its use as a dye agent dates to the pre-colonial era, and it continues to be one of the few natural dye agents that many dedicated Andean weavers insist on using. Anil is believed to create a blue that cannot be replicated with synthetic dyes, according to many Andean weavers. The unique vibrancy of anil dye explains the Spanish colonial desire for textiles produced with it. However, the economic and aesthetic desire for anil directly opposed the colonial political agenda. Anil blue was popular among Spanish elites, which encouraged its continued production. However, the success of Spaniards in disarticulating Andean pre-Hispanic trade networks required that anil be imported from Central America, adding uncertainty to the procurement of the dye. Due to the precarity of Spain's control over long-distance trade routes, certain obrajes had to discontinue production of anil blue textiles at certain points throughout the colonial period, as was the case with the nearby Obraje of Pomacocha. The ODC never reported a suspension in the production, suggesting it procured anil from the Andean region while trade between Central America and Lima was interrupted. Alternatively, the ODC perhaps used Andean anil much earlier, and only on occasion did the ODC import the more expensive Central American anil. This strategy would have kept dye costs lower, while the continued importation of a sufficient amount made the budgeting strategy go unnoticed by colonial agents. Along with the requirement to use imported anil, the Spanish attempted to regulate how anil was used. In 1621, government mill regulations stipulated that every bolt of blue cloth should be dyed with not less than 2.2 kilograms of Nicaraguan indigo. While this may have been followed early on by ODC laborers, by 1798, ODC documents report 2 kilograms of anil were used to dye cloth. Tinteros, the men who dyed the textiles, may have left the wool in the copper dye vats longer to compensate for the weaker dye. Or they may have chosen to produce marginally less vibrant blue textiles than other rule-following obrajes did. It is unclear how often, if ever, agents enforced anil-related regulations at remote rural obrajes. What is clear is that the ODC did not adhere to colonial regulations related to dye. Instead, tinteros used a mix of indigenous knowledge and colonial regulations to dye the cloth. I was initially surprised that none of the textiles I analyzed were dyed with anil. Rather, the majority of textiles were dyed grays and browns. This can be explained, probably, by the cloth that I analyzed. Casta paintings depict women of different castas, including Indias, with blue clothing, but none of the cloth that I analyzed was clothing. I analyzed utilitarian household cloth, which would rarely have been dyed with the highly valued anil, especially in such a low-income area. Despite its elusiveness within the heirloom textile collection, dye at the ODC. Despite the large population of camelids that once thrived in the mountainous region outside of Ayacucho, sheep quickly replaced camelids at Chincheros. The Spanish introduced sheep were brought to Chincheros with the establishment of the Obraje during the late 16th century to supply the ODC with wool. During the early 16th century, diseases had decimated the camelid population. Sheep reproduced expeditiously in the highlands and quickly replaced the diminishing camelid population. Due to the rapid introduction of sheep in this region, it is not surprising that all of the textiles I analyzed were made of sheep's wool. The transition between camelid to sheep wool altered the texture of the textiles. Llama, alpaca, and sheep all have differently textured wool, which produces differently textured fiber. Llama fiber is coarse and was seldom used to make textiles before or during the colonial period. Alpaca fiber is soft and was often used to make textiles for clothing before the Spanish invasion. Sheep fiber falls between llama and alpaca, which makes it soft enough for clothing, but lacks the lavish, supple texture of alpaca fiber. Despite its luxurious feel, alpaca fiber was largely ignored by non-Indios in the Viceroyalty, who viewed alpacas as another breed of sheep early on. The ODC favored the European imported sheep because of their familiarity, availability, and the natural water repellent quality of sheep's wool. Once the sheep were sheared, the wool was cleaned with sakta root, then was sent to the spinners to be spun. The ODC implemented two different spinning technologies, spindle wheels and puskas, to exploit as many laborers as possible. The ODC imported European spindle wheels to spin the wool, but they require strength applied to a foot pedal or handlebar to operate the wheel, which meant that very young children did not have the necessary strength to operate them. This was not ideal for ODC administrators, who viewed children as an exploitable source of labor. Spinning was viewed as the least skilled labor role and thus an ideal task for children. To incorporate children into the spinning process, puskas were incorporated into the ODC alongside European spindle wheels. On a puska, the spindle whorl is attached to a set of fibers and afterwards is suspended to rotate freely to provide torsion for the fiber. The puskas took much less physical space in the workspace and could be more easily operated by children than the spindle wheels. The reliance upon Andean technologies placed the Rolly licensed mill in an awkward position because they were supposed to destabilize Andean knowledge to strengthen colonial control in the region. Profits outweighed the awkwardness for ODC administrators who chose to illegally exploit child labor for their financial gain. This in turn further reified Casta as poor indigenous children spent their childhood laboring at the ODC, while the wealthy Spanish descendant children of ODC administrators spent their childhood with tutors learning arithmetic and composition. Therefore, while lower Casta children were raised in a system of debt peonage and illegal exploitative labor practices, higher Casta children were raised in a system of privilege and educative practices meant to better their future. Weavers at the ODC wove on imported trado looms. The trado loom originated in China and was introduced to the Iberian Peninsula by the 12th century. Due to the speed and efficiency of this technology, the trado loom was quickly incorporated into commercial textile production for the Iberian Peninsula. The Spanish introduced the trado loom into the Andes following their belief that they were more efficient than backstrap looms. Trado looms allow for several yards of cloth to be produced in one go, whereas backstrap looms require one to sew yards together after they are woven. The textiles I analyzed were all produced on trado looms, which, alongside historical data, suggests it was the only type of loom used at the ODC, as it maximized yardage production and minimized the amount of labor. The type of loom was dictated by ODC administrators, but the weave patterns were less regulated. There was a mix of basic weaves and twill weaves amongst the textiles analyzed, which reveals variation amongst weavers at the ODC. As Hendon had noted, basic weaves are more common in pre-Hispanic Latin American textiles than they are in pre-colonial European textiles, much like twill weaves are more common in pre-colonial European textiles than in pre-colonial American textiles. This isn't to say there is not an abundance of pre-colonial American twill textiles and pre-colonial European basic weave textiles, just to say that there was more common in one and the other. The use of both twills and basic weave textiles is notable because it suggests the continuation of a popular indigenous pattern alongside the incorporation of a popular Spanish pattern. The combination of basic and twill patterns may signify generational differences, stylistic preferences amongst weavers, and fashion trends. If the use of basic weave versus twill is generational, earlier weavers likely preferred basic weaves, while later weavers wove in twill patterns. Generational differences in weaving patterns may be the result of how weaving was unskilled or learned at the ODC. Outside of Obrajes, children learned to weave by watching elders weave. As a result, children tended to weave in similar manners as those who taught them to weave. As a general rule, far less innovation occurs when individuals learn to as children watching elders because there is not as much experimentation or self-education. However, in places where individuals learn to weave on their own or alongside novice peers, greater levels of innovation occur. Due to the spatialization of laborers at the ODC, weavers were not unskilled watching older weavers. Instead, weavers at the ODC were given cursory lessons when they aged into their jobs as weavers, and much of their training was on the job and self-taught. Of course, the variety in weave patterns produced at Chincheros could reflect stylistic preferences amongst contemporaneous Obraje weavers. Throughout my weaving course, I always use twill patterns when possible out of personal preference. Additionally, stylistic preferences change over time. Fashion is ever evolving, and weave patterns likely came in and out of fashion throughout the 250 years the ODC operated. Twill weaves may have been stylistically in one moment and out the next. Albeit removed from the high fashion worlds of Lima and Madrid, ODC laborers purchased textiles from the Iberian Peninsula as part of the reparto system. Therefore, they would have been aware of trends within Iberian woolen textiles and may have tried to emulate them within their weavings. Those who wished to emulate high fashion garments would have wanted affordable textiles that looked similar enough to pass as expensive imported garments. Further research is needed before substantiated arguments can be made about the variations seen in textile patterns at ODC produced textiles. However, we do know that both twill and basic weaves were produced at the ODC on treadle looms. The variation may have been caused by the unskillment of weavers, stylistic preferences, and market values, or a combination of all or some of those factors. The textiles produced at the Obraje were amalgamations of European and indigenous techniques and technologies, which went on to influence the larger colonial aesthetic. This placed weavers in an important position of power as they influenced the sensible colonial experience through their textiles. In so doing, textile producers at the ODC created textiles that were unique to the colonial Andes. Some textiles were then fashioned into clothing, which was one of the main markers of casta. Andean reliance upon clothing as a marker of casta placed mainly indigenous, rural, poor textile producers in important positions of power because they created the sensorial characteristics of the textiles, which were imbued with colonial meanings. Through the amalgam of techniques and traditions, textile producers at the ODC contributed to the creation of the colonial Andean aesthetic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. If everyone could please come back in video and audio form. I will express a series of questions that have appeared in the Q&A section. The first question that I have is for Maria Davila from Barbara Sansu-Pickett. She asks, at what time of year are the festivities for San Benito or San Isidro?
Well, there are several times of the years. Specifically for San Isidro, that is the same pattern for the land, is always occurs in May. But for San Benito, sometimes is most half of the year. For example, the picture which we show you are from San Benito y Mucuchíes, that is the 28th of December. But here in my community, San Benito is in November. So it's a saying that people is so devout that the festivities goes in every community in different times.
María, quisiera agarrar la oportunidad de que hablen acerca del telar.
Ajá, bueno, we are having this 24 chaff loom ABL with a compu dobi. So our weaves require the full 24 shaft because it's a triple weave and it requires for each layer 6 shaft. And for the moriche fiber, palm fiber from the Orinoco River Delta, it requires another 6 shaft. That's what we do in the loom.
Great. Well, I hope that answer reached its intended recipient. Thank you so much. And I hope we all have more opportunity to see and learn about your work. I have a comment for Maria Smith from Loretta Crippen. She asks, do you know what their objections are possibly to showing photographs that you might be able to share? If they prefer not, do you know why? Think of ways to overcome this, or if not, there might be several reasons why they don't want to share them, either afraid of copying photos and patterns, if they desire to write something themselves. So good luck with that.
Thanks. Yeah, I think obviously I can't speak for the community. They don't always go into detail after no. But from what I've gathered from working with them, there's a large distrust of outsiders to begin with. This was a community that was hit very hard during the Sendero conflict by both sides. And so they're very slow to trust, I guess, of outsiders, especially outsiders who don't speak any Quechua, which I am learning, but it's very slow. It's been very difficult for me to pick it up. So I think that they can be there when I'm analyzing them in person, but they're not sure of what I'm going to do when I leave. And they do want to start a museum at the site. They're trying to raise funds for that. So I think that there is a fear that I'm going to go show people, and people are going to get a lot of interest outside of the community. And rather than people coming to their museum when it's created, they're worried that people are going to come and try to take them from them. And because they have seen such atrocities committed, I think they're very fearful of what people will do to get the textiles. So that's why I'm hoping that through building trust and through explaining, what I want to do and why I want to hype up these textiles so people come to the museum and see what wonderful things their ancestors were creating. I think slowly I might be able to get some yeses, but I think it's going to take some time, yeah.
So from Victor Pimentel, also a question for Maria Smith. What types of materials, artifacts, or other materials from field excavations from this period could help define the contributions made by colonial weavers to Obraje de San Marcos de Chincheros?
Yes, so I was hoping to do excavations this summer, but hopefully next summer, the following summer, whenever it's safe to go back down and be excavating. I would imagine from other obrajes that have been excavated, I will find a lot of pieces of looms, of spindles, of puskas, different sorts of textile production pieces that can help explain things. A lot of times there are complaints of workers being locked in their workspaces and unable to leave for days at a time. So I would imagine that I'll find some locks too, evidence of either mistreatment of workers or there's also some great documents about workers being able to celebrate Inca holidays. So I might be able to find some evidence of those celebrations left over. So yeah, we'll see what happens when I'm actually able to put a trowel in the ground, but I'm hopeful that we're going to find some good stuff.
So another question for you. What were the types of pieces, the form of the textiles woven? Do you find any that may have the same functions as Inca pieces, or colonial forms, or yardage for clothing versus mantles?
So that's a great question. From the pieces that I've seen, a majority are either yardage or they're sewn into some sort of a colonial form. But the thing is that because they have been passed down, they could have been altered later on. So they might have been made originally to be used in more of a traditional format, but then over time, as needs changed or as styles changed, as new people inherited the textiles and were like, oh, that's old school, I want it to look like this, they could have also been editing as we go. And so that's kind of a tricky question to answer specifically. All I can tell you is what I see now, but that doesn't always mean that that's what it was like when it was originally produced and used.
So I just like to say I was very excited to hear Maria's talk, and she introduced me to aspects of the Venezuelan highlands that I was unaware of before. So I want to express that gratitude and the beauty of the landscape and the beauty of the textiles and the individuals involved. That was really exciting. And I look forward to its publication. Please, everyone, if you have any more follow-up and you want more detail, send an email, and I look forward to seeing you all soon in person and online. Thank you so much.